You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We are back live, and I hope you enjoyed your Christmas holiday, and I suspect many of you are still off this week, and if you are, I hope you'll be listening to the program for its 3 hours. Of course, we broadcast first 2 hours in some of the local stations, and then from 1 o'clock our time to 3 o'clock our time, we have the national program. So this hour gives me a chance to talk to many of you that are in places like Texas or Minnesota or a few other places where you may be tuning in. And so I thought this first hour might spend just a few minutes at least talking about what is happening in the stock market. If you don't like roller coasters, you don't want to be in the stock market right now. My plan was, at least last night, was to talk about why we have seen such a precipitous drop in the stock market, the role of the Federal Reserve, not to get into it too deeply, but at the same time recognize that there might be a couple of issues that would be educational for us, and but won't get into the weeds too much. And then, of course, we have the announcement that this morning, and by this time, about just a few minutes ago, the Dow Jones average went up 526 points. So it rebounded from one of the worst Christmas Eve days on the stock market ever to what could be a banner day. We'll see where this goes in the next couple of hours. The bottom line, I think, is due to the fact that when the stock market drops, some say, I don't think it's going to drop a lot more, and this is the time, as they always say, when there's blood in the streets, time to go out and buy. So I think some of the individuals said this is a perfect opportunity now that the stock market has reached lower levels to go out and to make that purchase. So again, we have a surge taking place, but even apart from that, let's, if we can, try for just a few minutes to try to make some sense out of this. And then we're going to move on to what's happening in Syria. Let me just mention that, of course, we have a government shutdown. I'm going to wait till the next hour to talk about the 9 myths about the government shutdown that I think are important. And since it is Wednesday, even though I have no millennials sitting across from me, we're going to talk about millennials anyway. Millennials much poorer than their parents is one of the articles we posted there. So we have a lot to cover, and we will certainly try to do that over the next couple of hours. Might also mention, while we talk about the shutdown, that has to do, of course, with funding the wall. And it turns out that some Americans have said, you know, we're just not going to wait. We're just going to create this GoFundMe page. Now, again, it's one thing to raise $5 billion, which is what, of course, is being asked of the federal government. It's another to have 17 million, but let's give credit where credit is due. This may be the most successful GoFundMe campaign before it's through that's ever been down. And if you haven't noticed, I did think this was kind of interesting. Then you have some left-wing activists, and one particular activist and a transgender military veteran, that's, yes, checking every possible box here, put together a GoFundMe campaign to actually, it's called Ladders to Get Over Trump's Wall. In other words, they want to use money to fund illegal aliens seeking asylum into this country. So that one hasn't, by the way, done quite as well. But we'll talk about that a little bit later as we get into questions about the wall, funding, and all the rest. At any point, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I know calls usually are pretty slow from Christmas to New Year's, but if you want to make a phone call, you are welcome to do so. Or another idea that I might suggest is go to the website, pointofview.net, and leave a comment there, or go to Facebook And we broadcast live there, and there's a place where you can leave some comments as well. So we'll pick up some of those in just a minute. Okay, let's talk about the impact of the Federal Reserve, because what you have here is something that doesn't, for some of us, make a great deal of sense. The stock market has not done well when the economy is doing well. And so this is why I posted one of these articles about financial panic, and that is a Breitbart article. Then I've also posted one on the Federal Reserve, and that one is by our friend Stephen Moore, who's been on the program. But I thought before I get to either of those articles, I might just read the editorial that came out in the Wall Street Journal. And it said that public officials who try to calm nervous financial markets with soothing words rarely succeed, as Stephen Mnuchin learned Monday. Treasury Secretary, by the way, he is the Treasury Secretary, tweeted Sunday that America's 6 largest banks told him in telephone calls that they had ample liquidity for lending in operations, and stocks fell promptly another 5% on Monday. Of course, as I just pointed out, they've picked back up. But this issue of liquidity, important. Are we going to go so far down in the stock market that banks can't meet their obligations? The answer is no problem there. But as the editorial board points out, trading on Christmas Eve, which was Monday, and the markets closed early, maybe because bank liquidity isn't what investors were worried about. The stock markets had fallen by that time 4 straight trading days since the Federal Reserve again raised its benchmark interest rate and signaled no change in the pace of its quantitative tightening since the Fed's announcement on 2 p.m. Wednesday, which was a week ago Wednesday. The Standard & Poor 500 had fallen 8%, Dow Jones average 8% through Monday. And so it goes on to talk about equity prices fluctuating and all of the rest. But as they say here, as we've argued during President Trump's search for a new Fed chairman, the traditional debate about monetary hawks and doves isn't helpful in the post-crisis era. The Fed is engaging in an unprecedented experiment of simultaneously unwinding its balance sheet and normalizing interest rates. Various sages may think they know how this is going to turn out, but I love what the editors of the Wall Street Journal said. We don't. Okay, you have to be really careful right now if you are investing in the stock market when some of the brightest people in the world that work with the Wall Street Journal, some of the brightest financial wizards on Wall Street, and you say, what's going to happen? And they go, I don't know. And so if you think you've got it figured out, great. But I think right now this is one of those really odd times in which there is kind of this experiment going on, trying to deal with the balance sheet issues, also trying to get interest rates up. And in just a minute, when we come back from the break, I'll explain why the Federal Reserve keeps raising interest rates. And it goes back to a famous quote, and I don't know if I can find it here fast enough, but it was an interesting quote. Oh, yes, it is. Fed chairman years ago, William Martin, said, the Fed's job is to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going, which is a silly way of saying that if the economy is doing really well, and it has been, by the way, if you have not been listening to Point of View, you haven't been listening very carefully, haven't been listening very often, the economy is doing very well. Median family income, highest it's ever been. The tax revenues in the first month of the 2018-2019 fiscal year, higher than they've ever been any October, and last October were a record, and all sorts of other things. So as a result, the economy is getting hot, and so there are people at the Federal Reserve thinking it's getting too hot, so we have to cool it down. Well, how do we cool it down? We keep raising interest rates. I was just getting my hair cut, hope it looks nice, and I'm talking to my barber, interestingly enough, and he's telling me about an individual that decided to wait a year to buy his house, one of the guys he just cut hair for. And he said, you know, when I was going to buy this house in, I think it was Plano, it was at 3% interest rate. Now it's almost at 7% interest rate. So it doesn't take long to figure out that waiting 1 year cost him a lot. And now he's actually said it cost him so much, he says, I think I'm going to live with my mother a little bit longer as well. Interest rates make a difference. It will cool the economy, perhaps too much. We'll take a break with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we need to help the next generation learn to navigate the culture. And that is why I'm so excited that John Stonestreet and Brent Kunkel have written the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. The rowboat on the cover reminds us that this emerging generation will have to navigate through choppy waters. John was on my radio program recently to talk about the book and share his experiences from Summit Ministries and the Chuck Colson Center. Both of the authors have ministered to thousands of students and their parents. They're facing a range of challenges, from digital media to pornography to drugs to transgender issues. They not only focus on the hot-button issues we hear about and read about every day, they focus on the undercurrents in the culture we often miss. Those would be consumerism, materialism, addiction, the sexual revolution, racial tension, extended adolescence, and the key principles of wisdom and virtue. On our radio program, we also talked about the challenges the millennial generation face, especially in an age with greater hostility towards Christianity. They also must do so in a digital world that moves much faster than in previous generations. This book will equip them and their parents to address many of the cultural issues other generations never had to consider. Another helpful aspect of the book is the attempt to answer or refute many of the cultural lies in our society. Technology helps spread these lies quickly. Christians will need biblical discernment to deal with so many lies that are assaulting biblical truth. They say that young people can either celebrate, create, confront, co-opt, or correct cultural trends and habits. Obviously, we must stand for biblical truth and correct cultural trends, but we also must do it with love and compassion. This book provides a model for all of us to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And again, hope you've had a great Christmas. Looking forward to New Year's. And let me just mention that as we come to some of these breaks from time to time, I'm going to mention the fact that as we come to year end, we would certainly appreciate your financial support. We really do need it. I wouldn't ask for it if we were doing well. Half salaries are enough at this point to say, yes, I think we really have some needs, and year end is really important, especially just to help us make up some of the shortfall that we've had. So again, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. We have a $65,000 matching fund, which means your gift of $100 becomes $200. $200 becomes $400. Perhaps some of you might even want to consider for this next year becoming part of the Truth Team and helping us out. But a couple of the articles we've posted on the website, pointofview.net, the first one I entitled Financial Panic, and it has to do with the whether or not there's maybe a panic on the part of the Federal Reserve. In just a minute, I'm going to do a teaching on, a lot of you might say, I don't really know much about the Federal Reserve. I hear it talked about all the time. As I jokingly have said over the years, the Federal Reserve, first of all, is not a federal agency, per se, not part of the federal government, and it has questionable reserves. So it is interesting that you call it Federal Reserve. But nevertheless, I'll give you the history of that in just a minute. But the new chairman is a man by the name of Jerome Powell, and after the markets closed, there was kind of this financial panic, which this article talks about. Of course, the stocks rebounded 523 points last time I checked. We'll give you an update a little bit later by the end of the program. But this particular article, I think, is a very good summary by Joel Pollack, who says that the Dow Jones Industrial Average suffered its worst day on Christmas Eve trading ever, falling over 640 points. Now, it's made up about 500 and something of those points right now. Analysts blame the Secretary of Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, for announcing Sunday evening on Twitter that he had convened individual calls with the CEOs of the nation's 6 largest banks, that he determined that they have ample liquidity available for lending to consumer, business markets, and other market operations. This implied that there had been a good reason to worry. Indeed, there have been, after the Fed raised interest rates by another 0.25% on Friday for the 4th time this year. And so the article goes on to say, with almost all the data, aside from the stock market, still point to a robust economy, the rising interest rates have evidently weighed heavily on companies that took out large amounts of debt during the long periods of quantitative easing. That's back when we had the so-called Great Recession of 2007, 2008, and 2009. So despite the strongest job market in decades, rising wages, and economic growth well above 3%, Wall Street worries about liquidity threatening to put an end to the good times, thanks in part to Powell and the Federalists. And this is why right now, if you aren't even a financial manager, you still have to be saying, okay, I don't know that much about economics. And by the way, I'd be glad to give you a copy of my book, Christians in Economics, which we make available on our website. But you still have to be saying, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, again, wages are rising, economic growth, the best we've seen in 10 years. It's a strong job market. There are more jobs than people to fill them. Everything is saying that the economic markets are doing really well. And that has to do with the fact that the Federal Reserve is saying, yeah, well, that's the problem. Now we might have such high functioning, heated up markets that it might overheat and then crash. And that brings us back to that famous quote by Fed Chairman William Martin, who said Fed's job is to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. And, of course, some have suggested there's a political motive. And I thought this was interesting. If you see this graph out on Facebook right now, I've seen it in a couple of places, it shows economic growth and it shows the stock market and things like that under the Obama administration. Then it shows under the Trump administration shooting up. And then it shows going down, and the point at which it goes down is the day in which Democrats actually were elected to take control of the House of Representatives. Now, that may be a little too political there. I do believe that's part of the answer. I mean, if you don't think that there are some people wondering what a democratically controlled House of Representatives is going to be like, and wondering what kind of disruption and gridlock will take place, I think that's one of the reasons. I think another very good reason is indeed what we just talked about, this concern that you might have an exuberant market. But I think number 3, I love this line here, some Trump supporters could be forgiven for suspecting a political motive, especially since some Trump haters celebrated the market slide in hopes that it will shake Republican support for Trump. And, of course, you've heard many individuals ranging from some of the talk show hosts at late night to some of the other politicians actually hoping the economy would tank so that they have a good prospect of defeating Donald Trump 2 years from now. So we'll see where that goes. Second article I've posted real quickly, and then we'll give you kind of a teaching on the Federal Reserve from Stephen Moore. And again, he points out the same kind of things, that now you have the central bank pulling back on money so it will slow growth, and maybe even crash the stock market, and he says for what he calls non-existent inflation. As a matter of fact, the argument being made right now is that you really have to begin to pull back so we don't have inflation. And I like what Stephen Moore says. Inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods, and that's not what's happening right now. So, again, he looks at the fact that from October 3rd, which coincidentally, he said, was right after Powell gave us a speech saying that the Fed might be through tightening money, the Dow has fallen more than 3,500 points. And as a result, then he asked this fundamental question. What is to be done now? Well, Trump wants to fire the Fed chairman, though it's doubtful he has the authority to do so. No, that would not be a good idea. Plus, I'm not sure he would be able to, as I will explain in just a minute when we go through a little bit of the teaching on the Federal Reserve. But much better here, Stephen Moore says, for Powell, that would be, again, Jerome Powell, the federal chairman, to do the honorable thing and admit that his policies have had a disastrous economic and financial consequences, Don't you know that if they went back and said, we decided we're not going to raise interest rates, I think we would see another booming economy. And if nothing that happens, maybe we're back to that one question that was really, I think, poignantly raised, and that is some of the people that are in the Federal Reserve, some of the people in the so-called swamp in Washington, D.C., do not like Donald Trump. And when the economy has been blowing and going, and then all of a sudden you have interest rates dropping the stock market, you can't help but wonder if there might be some political motivation there. But nevertheless, that's a story and a conversation for another day. But some of you might say, where did the Federal Reserve come from? Well, it goes back to 1913, where it was created as a passage of what was called the Federal Reserve Act. And this was where just a group of bankers got together. They were at the time called the Monopoly Men. They traveled in a sealed train to Jekyll Island, Georgia, using code names to put together their plan to form a central bank. Now, they weren't successful at first, but they were able to eventually get the bill signed during Christmas season when not all the members of Congress were there. President Wilson quickly signed it, and so then you have now a central bank, which is somewhat related to the federal government in that the president can indeed appoint the Federal Reserve Chairman, but the rest of it is pretty much controlled by those individual banks. Back in 1933, Treasury Secretary William Wilden talked about it this way. He said, the Reserve Act lets us print all that we'll need. It won't frighten people. It won't look like stage money. It will be money that looks like money. And if you notice, pull out your dollars right now in your purse or your wallet, you'll notice that these are not backed by gold. They're not backed by silver. They are simply a promissory note from the Federal Reserve. And, of course, we've had central banks in the past. We had a central bank from 1836 when then it was closed, up until 1836, when Andrew Jackson closed what was called the Second Bank of the United States. And from 1836 to 1930, we did not have a Federal Reserve Bank or anything thereof. But now, of course, we have a bank, a Federal Reserve, that was established under some of the most questionable circumstances. If you've ever read the whole story, it is fascinating about that. But if nothing else, just a reminder that some of the individuals that control your life are individuals that are not elected. They are appointed and actually serve on the Federal Reserve, and they have as much, if not more, control over your life than anyone else. Anybody that thinks Donald Trump has control of your life, just go out and try to buy a house right now. Just go out there and try to finance a car. And that interest rate that you're paying is in large part conditioned by the index interest rate established by the Federal Reserve. And so in some respects, most of you probably could not name the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. But so far, he's exercised a tremendous amount of power over your life. And that's why maybe we need to do another teaching program about economics, the stock market, the Federal Reserve. And so we will do that sometime in the future here on Point of View. We come back, though, I want to talk about Syria. It's in the news, and I want to give you both a point and a counterpoint on how to think through some of those issues. We'll be back right after this.
They are sincere, but respectfully, we think they're wrong. As Kerby said in a recent email, there are Christian leaders claiming that we've lost the sexual revolution, and if we don't compromise, if we don't give up a bit more, we'll lose our religious freedom entirely. Now, you listen to Point of View, you know the truth. We do face battles, but we firmly believe now is not the time to wave a white flag. Followers of the sovereign king never give up or compromise truth. We urge you to stand boldly with us for our freedoms. Some of your fellow listeners have stepped up and are encouraging you to give by matching your gift up to $65,000. In other words, when you donate to this mission, they will double the impact of your gift. Every $20 becomes $40, $50 becomes $100, $1,000 multiplies to $2,000. Invest online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Let's send 2018 out with a powerful statement. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation. I thought we would spend just a little bit of time here talking about Syria before the hour is up. And then the next hour, we're going to look at the 9 myths about the federal shutdown. We're going to talk about the wall. We're going to talk about the GoFundMe project and a number of others. And the reason I wanted to do this is, number one, Syria is in the news. But number two, last week when we had Nick Pitts with us, Nick made, I think, what was a very impassioned argument for why the United States should not leave Syria. So I felt that it might be appropriate to kind of give the other side, and that is a piece that we've posted here by Andrew McCarthy. And, of course, we think very highly of him as well. As a matter of fact, in some respects, I think some of his arguments are more compelling. But what he is doing is responding to some of the arguments being made by the editors of the National Review, and in particular David French, who's also been on the program, matter of fact, in studio with us. So this, I think, illustrates a point that I want to make before we go much further, and that is there are a number of issues where there really is, I have to say, the Christian position on it, on issues like abortion, sexual sin, a variety of others. There's the other side is not biblical. But when you come to some of these issues, especially many of the foreign policy issues, you can find a situation where people of goodwill, maybe even that have a Christian worldview, come to very different conclusions about this situation. David French, because he's a Christian, I think also is concerned about the Kurds. And I found this one today. I don't know how many of you listen to National Public Radio, but National Public Radio had this wonderful quote from an individual, Hatim Hassan. He actually runs a money exchange shop in that Syrian area. And this is a powerful statement. He said, if they will leave, meaning the United States, we will curse them as traitors. The Kurds helped them to destroy ISIS. I have 7 people from my family who were fighting ISIS and who were killed, and they were very young, not even in their 20s. You can't blame him for his anger. And to me, the most compelling arguments for staying in Syria are our commitment, so that people don't think that we will cut and run at the first difficulty, which, by the way, has not been that difficult. I think I mentioned last Friday when we had Kelly Shackelford here, how many Americans have been killed in Syria? 5. That's all it is. So we have done very well there, but also just because of the Kurds, because of the friendship and appreciation we have for them and the desire to continue to put ISIS on the run, those are the compelling arguments for staying in Syria. So let me read just a couple of those, and then I want to give you the counterpoint by Andrew McCarthy, who is, again, making some statements I would agree with as well. Are we ever going to bring about any stability in places like Syria or Afghanistan anyway, given the fact that they are dominated by Sharia supremacy? So we'll get into that in just a minute. But again, reading first from the editors of the Wall Street National Review, I should say, they said the American military intervention in Syria represents one of the most successful and cost-effective military operations of the post-9/11 era. At a minimum cost in human lives, American lives in particular, through maximum cooperation with courageous Kurdish and Arab allies, the ISIS caliphate has been reduced to rubble. Very true. Russian and Iranian ambitions in Syria have been checked, and the United States has gained valuable territorial leverage in the negotiation for a permanent peace settlement in the Syrian civil war. I'm not so sure I buy that one, but I'll leave it as it is. But there is work left to be done, they say. ISIS is down but not out. Our Syrian allies remain vulnerable, and Russia and Iran retain their own ambitions for regional domination. That's why Trump's advisors have repeatedly talked him out of making a serious error by abandoning Syria before the mission is complete. As recently as September, he seemed to have reached a definitive definition and decision. American forces would stay, and we'd begin a renewed diplomatic push for a sustainable peace. Well, as we well know, that did not happen. Let me jump over to one of the other key paragraphs in this particular piece. They say, the ISIS caliphate, the physical nation-state they tried to build in 2014 and 2015, is largely in ruins. ISIS, the terrorist organization, still exists, and it still has thousands of fighters, it is still a threat, and an American retreat gives it the potential to recreate safe havens in Syrian territory. Moreover, Trump's retreat empowers both Iran and Russia, granting a great strategic gift to two of America's chief geopolitical foes. When Vladimir Putin intervened in Syria's civil war to save the Assad regime, Barack Obama famously warned that Russia was getting sucked into a quagmire. In fact, Russia's intervention has so far been an unmitigated success. He helped tip the balance of power in the civil war, secured continued access to Russia's naval base in Tartus, and restored Russian influence in the region to a level not seen since the Cold War. So that's kind of the argument that people would make for staying in Syria. But for the rest of the time, I want to just read pieces out of this article that is posted by Andrew McCarthy. Now, again, just to remind you, Andrew McCarthy now writes for National Review. He's the senior fellow there, but an individual who was very much instrumental during the years in which George Herbert Walker Bush was president, in which he successfully prosecuted those who tried to tear down the World Trade Center, the first attack on it, and has been a real student of Islam because of that. And so he calls this the Syrian fairy tale lives, because he says, unlike my colleagues, I've been a spectator during the Syrian follies. As readers of this column know, I believe the United States has less interest in Syria than in the persistence of drought in Burkina Faso. You might say, where is Burkina Faso? It turns out, I had to look it up myself. It's one of the very small countries, one of the 54 countries in Africa. The point he's making is we have about as much strategic interest in Syria as we do this very small nation kind of near the Congo in Africa. Again, maybe a little bit of overplay there, but again, I think it helps us understand this only so well. Because he says, I've been a steadfast naysayer on American intervention in a conflict among rivals whose common ground consists of hatred for America and affinity for Sharia supremacism. And if nothing else, talks about some of the situation there. He says, there's always been this argument that President Obama, by removing forces from Iraq, created a vacuum in which ISIS spontaneously generated. And what his argument is, and again, people that support Barack Obama, and I just noticed the other day in a poll that most Americans, a majority of Americans, think that Barack Obama was the most successful president in their lifetime, which is kind of interesting given the fact that so much of what he constructed is now being dismantled by Donald Trump, but that's another story. But he said Obama did not create the Islamic State. Sharia supremacism did. What no one in Washington pontificating on Syria and neighboring Iraq cares to acknowledge is that this region is a tinderbox of fundamentalist Islam in which, if there was no intervention by outside forces, Sunnis and Shiites would be slaughtering each other until some strongman imposed order. Of course, that's what we've had right now with the Assad regime. Then he goes on to say that it's been 17 years since 9/11 and 25 years since radical Islam declared war against the United States by bombing the World Trade Center, which, of course, is the one that he was involved with. Yet, head firmly in the stand, we continue to discuss such catastrophes as Syria as if the most critical fact on the ground, the power and prevalence of Sharia supremacism, did not exist. Consequently, we subscribe to delusional history and make policy around resulting storylines. So again, he says that the argument being made right now is to be completing the job of degrading ISIS into irrelevance. But again, Andrew McCarthy responds by saying, ISIS is simply a breakaway faction of al-Qaeda. It started long before President Obama was even in power. And it is a network franchise in Iraq during the anti-American insurgency that metastasized into a sectarian civil war. Al-Qaeda did not spontaneously generate either. It arose largely out of Afghan jihad against the Soviets. You may notice a pattern here, he says. The animating force is Sharia supremacism, jihadism, the conviction that there is a divine injunction to impose Islamic law on Muslim countries, and from there spread it globally. This is to be done by any means necessary through fundamentalist ideology, and makes violence the highest form of jihad. I'll come back and make a few other comments before we move on to some other issues. Next hour, we're going to look at, again, some of the myths about the shutdown. We're going to look at millennials, much poorer than their parents, and get into a couple of other very important topics that are surfacing in this week between Christmas and New Year's. But again, as we go to a break, I hope you'll also go to our website, pointofview.net. You're going to find a number of articles that we've been quoting from today, but most importantly, there's a button there, actually now a banner, Make Your Move, Give Boldly. We have a matching grant, and if you can help us out between now and the end of the year, we would greatly appreciate it. Recognize that this time next year, we're in 2019, so only got a few days and hours left. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Since 2012, First Liberty Institute has been investigating the rise in the number and severity of domestic attacks on religion. Each year, that investigation is compiled into our annual survey. We started that survey because wherever we went, people would tell us that they didn't think there was a genuine threat to religious liberty in our country. We call it Undeniable, the Survey of Religious Hostility to Religion in America. In the past year, the total number of documented attacks on religious liberty has increased by over 15%. Over the past 5 years, we have seen an alarming 133% increase. Of the 1,400 cases documented in Undeniable, you will see a myriad of faiths represented: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh, among others. Religious hostility in America does not seem to discriminate. But there is hope. First Liberty is battling for religious freedom in court, but you can join that fight by simply educating yourself and others about the rights we each have and how we can preserve them. If you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to go to firstliberty.org today and download your copy of the 2017 edition of Undeniable, or order a free copy for your friend. Despite the mounting hostility, First Liberty is prepared to stand against these relentless attacks for as long as it takes. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we're going to spend some time in the next hour looking at the shutdown and giving some of you a chance to join the conversation of whether or not it's worth a shutdown of part of the government over the wall. And so we'll get into that and talk about some of the private funding of that. And as well, I might just mention that we'll be looking at one of the articles we posted on millennials. And my commentary today, I might also mention, is a book review of A Practical Guide to Culture, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. And so if you are concerned about the millennial generation, that's certainly a book I would recommend. Also, last week we had a chance to have in studio with us Grant Skeldon. His book, The Passion Generation, is not only a good book about millennials, but it's really a book almost about discipleship as well. So there's some great commentaries out. This one today having to do with the culture and how to interact with it. A commentary I have coming out next week on Grant Skeldon's book. And, of course, we did the interview with him as well. So we'll be talking about millennials a little bit. Even though I'm not a millennial and I don't have any millennials sitting across from me, we'll talk about the millennials the next hour as well. Just to finish this off, though, one of the arguments that Andrew McCarthy was making is that even if you think we could destroy ISIS, and I don't think you'll ever completely eradicate them, his argument is that it's not going to do anything, because whether it's ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, the root cause is a virulent form of Islam that actually gives credence to the use of violent jihad to enact this attempt at trying to put together a universal caliphate. And one of the things that he says later in his article is there has never been any vacuum in Syria or even in Iraq. Sharia supremacism fills all voids. In focusing on ISIS, he says David French discounts Sharia supremacism as an idea. But it's much more than that. It's a cultural distinction, even as Samuel Huntington argued, a civilizational one. If you get either one of my books on Islam, I spend a section in my first book years ago on Islam, and even have a section in the new book on Islam and terrorism, talking about Samuel Huntington. He was a professor at Harvard University. One time I had a chance to actually sit at a panel with him, and how I got on that panel is always one of those interesting conversations, but nevertheless, he wrote this idea that we really are dealing with a different civilization. We have Chinese assertion, we have kind of Western democracy, and then we have Muslim militancy. And by that, he didn't mean that all Muslims are militant, but he did mean that the real great clashes in the future were not going to be like Civil War kinds of clashes as much as they will be the clash between the East and the West. Now, Russia's tried to insert itself into that, certainly some others, but really, when you look at it, the enemies that the United States have today, apart from Russia and China, which I'm not discounting, and I'm not saying they're not significant, but the greatest enemy has been this uniting of these radical Muslim forces and the attempt to not only destroy various democracies, but also ultimately to destroy Israel, the little Satan, and the United States, what is known as the great Satan. And so, in a sense, what we have Andrew McCarthy saying is that you could kind of push down ISIS, and it would be like the whack the gophers kind of idea. You slap one down and another one pops up, because that's really what's going on here. The cultural substrate, the cultural foundation is Sharia supremacism. Those individuals who have a view of Islam, of radical, violent Islam, that are continuing to fight against the Western world. He said the fact that it's Al-Qaeda which triggered the war on terror does not factor into America clamoring about Syria is telling. The anti-ISIS mission that is being described was not always the U.S. objective in Syria. First, we were going to pull some kind of attempt with Iraq and Libya and help the moderates overthrow Assad, but the moderates in the main are Muslim Brotherhood groups that are very content to align with Al-Qaeda jihadists. And so the difficulty that you find when you go into Syria, the difficulty we found when we went into Iraq, and the difficulty we still face because we have troops in Afghanistan is, who do we work with? I mean, who ultimately shares our democratic values? Who ultimately believes that we should give rights to all individuals, and who instead want to simply implement some kind of Islamic caliphate? And so what he says near the end here is if we stayed out of the way, America's enemies would continue killing each other. He says, that's fine with me. It's a crass thing to say, but that's kind of where we find ourselves. He says, I'm not indifferent to collateral human suffering, but it is a stable of Sharia supremacist societies. We can no longer prevent it in Syria than in Burkina Faso, which he talks about again. Now, he says ultimately the other issue, the Kurds are a more complicated problem. We have a good deal with the Kurds. We protect them from Turkey. They kill jihadists. It would be shameful, he admits, to abandon them. And as you heard me say just a minute ago from this piece that was done by National Public Radio, if they leave, we will curse them as traitors. And I don't blame them for having that kind of feeling. But the reality is we aren't able to accomplish very much by keeping troops in Syria. So finally, he talks about the fact that there is another issue, and that is we really don't have congressional authority. The argument is it's past time, David French says, for a true congressional vote on American engagement in Syria. And as Andrew McCarthy agrees, the Constitution is not a suggestion, it's a law. But the reality is that we've never really had a vote, an up or down vote in Congress about being in Syria. And the facts is that because that is the case, it's never been really authorized by Congress in the first place. And there's some good reasons why that is the case, not the least of which is no senator or congressman wants to be accused of being a militarist. And in many cases, nobody really wants to take on what could be some kind of quagmire in the future. So again, he says, we all know the answer to this. President Obama did not seek congressional authorization for combat operations in Syria because Congress would have refused. And Congress does not want any president to ask for authorization because members do not want to be accountable. They want to go on cable TV and whine that whoever the president is has been heedless, whether for going in or for pulling out. And so his final conclusion is this. There's nothing for America in Syria. We haven't defeated ISIS by taking its territory, and it wouldn't matter if we did because Sharia supremacist culture guarantees that a new ISIS will replace the current one. The names change, but the enemy remains the same. And if you want to fight that enemy in an elective war, the Constitution demands that the people give their consent through the representatives in Congress. So when you hear some of the discussion being made about the whole issue of Syria, you might ask yourself a very good question, and that is, okay, if we do need to stay in Syria, the Congress could actually approve funds to do so, but will the Congress actually vote for those funds? And I think the answer to that is no. And I don't think that Nancy Pelosi is going to challenge that. So as you hear people come on some of these talking head shows and talk about how it's just reprehensible that we are leaving Syria, I think the question you need to ask those individuals, if you ever see them in a town hall meeting, is, well, would you pay for that? Would you allocate funds for it? And you're going to see a lot of them come up with very evasive answers because the reality is Congress really doesn't want to spend the money. Congress really doesn't want to approve troops in Syria. And I think that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump finally said, okay, I don't want to be there. It's wasting time, money, and financial resources. We're not going to accomplish anything, so it's time to pull out the troops. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to talk about the shutdown that's in the news, and we're going to talk about some of the myths about this federal shutdown. All that coming up right after this.
They are sincere, but respectfully, we think they're wrong. As Kerby said in a recent email, there are Christian leaders claiming that we've lost the sexual revolution, and if we don't compromise, if we don't give up a bit more, we'll lose our religious freedom entirely. Now, you listen to Point of View, you know the truth. We do face battles, but we firmly believe now is not the time to wave a white flag. Followers of the sovereign king never give up or compromise truth. We urge you to stand boldly with us for our freedoms. Some of your fellow listeners have stepped up and are encouraging you to give by matching your gift up to $65,000. In other words, when you donate to this mission, they will double the impact of your gift. Every $20 becomes $40, $50 becomes $100, $1,000 multiplies to $2,000. Invest online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Let's send 2018 out with a powerful statement. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope you've had a great Christmas holiday. And, of course, we're right now between Christmas and New Year's. This is a live program, so I'm going to really enjoy hearing from you this hour. And we've got a lot to cover. First of all, I have posted a couple of articles about the up and down of the stock market, and we may get to some of that a little bit later. The down was replaced by the up already. The loss in the, I guess it was Christmas Eve, has almost been completely recovered today, which leads me to oftentimes say that if you don't like a roller coaster, probably don't want to invest in the stock market right now, but we'll come back to some of that a little bit later. But the big issue, the one a lot of people are talking about, is, of course, the shutdown. So I thought we would spend just a little bit of time talking about that today for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is an attempt to try to fund this independently, and this has been pretty amazing. So I'll get to that in just a minute. The GoFundMe particular attempt to actually have a border wall GoFundMe has reached about $17 million. At the rate this is going, this may be one of the most successful GoFundMe projects ever, and that has also led then to an kind of Trump anti-wall funding by a left-wing activist and transgender military veteran. There's a woman that's actually clicked and checked every box, I think, possibly there, which has raised some money called Ladders to Get Over Trump's Wall. This would be money to help illegal aliens into this country. So there are some really important issues that we will be talking about when we get to the wall. But I thought for just a minute, we would take one of the articles I've posted on the website, which are called 9 Myths About the Federal Shutdown. Over the next couple of days, probably at the rate this is going, could be the next couple of weeks. Now, this could be resolved by the end of the week, but I got a feeling this one's going to last a while. You're going to hear all sorts of things being said about this federal shutdown, not the least of which is the fact that basically it's only a partial shutdown. And as we point out before, even when we have a shutdown, even though you're hearing people say, well, these people aren't going to get their money, they're not going to get their salaries. Yeah, they get it after the fact. And so I thought I would work our way through the 9 myths about the federal shutdown that were put together, and we have posted that on the website in case you would like to read those later or use those as you find yourself maybe in a point counterpoint, maybe on a Facebook post or a blog, or somebody says, isn't it terrible we've got the shutdown? Or others saying, I can't even believe we have a shutdown because I haven't noticed anything. So here's the 9 myths real quickly. Myth number 1, it is a shutdown. And then again, what Michael in this article says, if the deadline is missed, the lights of government are not going to be turned off. In fact, most of the functions will continue as nothing has happened because 75% of government has been fully budgeted into the coming year, including the Defense Department. So it is not a total government shutdown. It is at best a partial one. Myth number 2, public safety will be impacted. The U.S. Coast Guard was not included in the Department of Defense budget. As you may know, it's actually funded through the Department of Homeland Security, which is not one of those agencies at the moment being budgeted. Nevertheless, again, its essential functions and activities such as search and rescue, drug interdiction will continue as always. Coast Guard Chief Warrant Officer Barry Lane tells Newsmax that the service continues operations authorized by law that provides for national security or that protect life and property during the partial government shutdowns. Non-essential functions like testing and licensing merchant mariners, however, will be halted. But other than that, I think we're still kind of where we are. Myth number 3, the public will be strongly impacted. Well, again, self-funded government functions such as the U.S. Postal Office, and I just was at the post office a minute ago, can I tell you nothing is different there at all, will continue as usual. We had a question on Friday about Social Security, and Social Security checks to retirees and disabled workers will go out on time as though nothing had happened. Veterans will continue to receive benefits, and federal retirees will continue receiving their checks. Non-essential functions such as passport applications and renewals will come to a halt. And even though I sent in a passport renewal there, I know that will sit around for a day or two longer, but nevertheless, that's where that is. Myth number 4, monuments will be closed. Well, it turns out that national parks, being another non-essential federal function, are normally closed during a shutdown. However, national monuments such as Washington, D.C.'s Lincoln Memorial, the Vietnam War Memorial, and the World War II Memorial are normally left open. Of course, that was not what happened in 2013, you might remember, because at that time, President Obama and his administration ordered these attractions be barricaded. Remember that? I mean, the World War II monument, you really can't barricade it out because it's open, but they had barricades around it anyway because they were, as one park ranger said, we've been told to make life as difficult for people as we can. But based on past experience, we know that will not happen this time. If there is a shutdown, and it, of course, is, the current administration will in all likelihood make it as painless as possible. And so none of these attractions were closed during the brief January shutdown this last year. Myth number 5, the Smithsonian will be closed, just like the memorials. President Obama kept the Smithsonian closed, as just like the other memorials. All indications are that President Trump intends to keep the Smithsonian open and running. Myth number 6, shutdown only affects the federal government. No, actually, states can sometimes feel the effect of a partial federal government shutdown, and so that could be certainly the case because they rely on a number of things from the federal government, so there may be some discomfort and dysfunction there. Myth number 7, troops deployed overseas will be denied recreational activities. And again, back in the 2013 shutdown, the Obama administration closed the American Forces Network, which broadcasts sports and entertainment venues to soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and Coast Guard. During the January shutdown, of course, the Trump administration kept the games coming and the troops entertained, and there's no reason to believe that that will change this time. Myth number 8, shutdowns save money. Well, not so. Shutdowns actually cost the taxpayer because even though furloughed workers are not working, the government traditionally pays them retroactively. So basically, you're paying people at least 1/4 of the federal government for doing no work. And actually, a backlog will build up pretty quickly on some of those projects. And then myth number 9, visitors will be shut out of Mount Vernon. And again, back in 2013, we might remember the Obama administration actually barricaded entry to George Washington's estate. And then they were embarrassed because it turns out that Mount Vernon is neither owned nor administered by the National Park Service. It is privately owned, and the administration itself ultimately was red-faced, assuming there was any shame on the part of anybody that did that, with the embarrassment at the time, and the mistake will not be repeated. That is the 9 myths of the federal shutdown. I ran through them pretty quickly and gave you kind of a summary of each one, but if you find yourself wondering what that shutdown really going to do, this is kind of the definitive article. It's the 3rd one we've posted on the website, and I would encourage you to get a copy of it because a lot of this actually is locked away at the Newsmax area, and because I have access to it, I wanted you to have access to it as well. So let me encourage you to find out a little bit more about the shutdown. And as we come to a break, I'd love to hear about your comments. Do you think it's time to shut down the government and build the wall? 1-800-351-1212. Be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we need to help the next generation learn to navigate the culture. And that is why I'm so excited that John Stonestreet and Brent Kunkel have written the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. The rowboat on the cover reminds us that this emerging generation will have to navigate through choppy waters. John was on my radio program recently to talk about the book and share his experiences from Summit Ministries and the Chuck Colson Center. Both of the authors have ministered to thousands of students and their parents. They're facing a range of challenges, from digital media to pornography to drugs to transgender issues. They not only focus on the hot-button issues we hear about and read about every day, they focus on the undercurrents in the culture we often miss. Those would be consumerism, materialism, addiction, the sexual revolution, racial tension, extended adolescence, and the key principles of wisdom and virtue. On our radio program, we also talked about the challenges the millennial generation face, especially in an age with greater hostility towards Christianity. They also must do so in a digital world that moves much faster than in previous generations. This book will equip them and their parents to address many of the cultural issues other generations never had to consider. Another helpful aspect of the book is the attempt to answer or refute many of the cultural lies in our society. Technology helps spread these lies quickly. Christians will need biblical discernment to deal with so many lies that are assaulting biblical truth. They say that young people can either celebrate, create, confront, co-opt, or correct cultural trends and habits. Obviously, we must stand for biblical truth and correct cultural trends, but we also must do it with love and compassion. This book provides a model for all of us to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to get your thoughts about this federal shutdown. We've had quite a number, and I think in some respects they aren't quite as momentous as the past because we've gone through so many of them. There was a time in which this wasn't a big issue, and we hadn't experienced too many of them. And so as a result, they sort of loomed larger. Today, of course, the shutdown is somewhat of the news. Of course, you also have that 8-year-old child from Guatemala died in U.S. custody, and this is the second one that has died. And of course, the argument being made is if we had a wall and it was very obvious that you could not make it across the border to the United States, maybe the parents wouldn't be bringing these children in the first place. Of course, those who actually are critical of the Trump administration say, see, there's another child that's died in ICE custody. So this debate is going to take place for some time. But I'd love to get your thoughts about this in terms of federal shutdowns. I read real quickly the 9 different myths about the federal shutdown. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Again, if you just joined us, we were talking about the fact that it is only a partial shutdown. Public safety will not be impacted. First of all, the Defense Department is funded, so the only area that might be of concern would be the Coast Guard, and that will also be funded. You have even these departments that are not funded right now, non-essential personnel stay home. They'll still get their paychecks eventually, probably sooner rather than later. But those people that are considered essential are not furloughed at all. And so, of course, that always leads to one of the other things. If we're sending non-essential people home, why do we have them in the government in the first place? Well, again, you can have that discussion with us if you want. I do know people that have worked in the federal bureaucracy, some of whom would be considered non-essential personnel in the sense that it isn't important for the day-to-day operations or for a person's life or property. But at the same time, it gets a little bit like theater when you start closing down the parks and those kinds of things. And those will be closed, but at least the national monuments will be open for anybody deciding to go to Washington, D.C. They'll still be able to make it to the Lincoln Memorial, the Vietnam War Memorial, the World War II Memorial. Smithsonian will still be open, as I mentioned just a minute ago. It affects the federal government, but also it does indirectly affect sometimes state governments. Troops will still be able to have recreational activities, unlike the shutdown in 2013, where the Obama administration closed down the Armed Forces Network. That will still be broadcasting sports and entertainment to soldiers, sailors, airborne, Marine, Coast Guard, and those kinds of individuals. And indeed, they will not be able to shut down Mount Vernon, even though the Obama administration, I always love that one, said, we're going to shut down Mount Vernon. Oh, really? The federal government does not have any jurisdiction over that particular home that is privately owned, privately administered, and you have no right to actually put barricades in front of something that is a private entity. That was somewhat embarrassing at the time, so we know that will not be closed as well. So anybody wanting to get a tour of some of the most historic areas in Washington, D.C. will still be able to do so. Now, why the shutdown? Well, the shutdown is for one very good reason, the desire to build some walls. Again, if you haven't seen these, here's what the walls look like for those of you online right now. These are what are called Bullard walls, and people sometimes say, well, that's not a wall, that's a fence. If you noticed the other day, President Trump was saying, we'll build a wall or a fence, whatever you want to call it, and I just love that because there was a debate a couple of weeks ago about, okay, is this a wall or is this a fence? Well, it's a wall that, and this one is 18 feet high. Some of the others are 30 feet high, but it actually has openings because it has steel borders between it, which then prevent individuals from climbing it very easily, but allows Border Patrol to see through and to see if somebody is trying to climb them or if there's some kind of nefarious activity on the other side, drug smugglers, human traffickers, or the rest. And so the wall, or the fence, whatever we want to call it, I'm still going to call it a wall because that's what it looks like to me, is one that the president believes could be funded at $5.7 billion. Now, the Democratic response has been, well, we don't have that money. In just a minute, I'm going to read to you all the things the Democrats hope that they will accomplish in the first couple of weeks in January, and I guarantee you the tab on that is a whole lot more than $5 billion. As we've pointed out before, given the enormous size of the federal government and the federal budget, $5 billion, although that sounds like a lot of money, it's a rounding error. It's matter of fact, it's so insignificant that more money than that probably is wasted in, sadly, a couple of these different cabinet offices. So the argument that we don't have the money doesn't work very well, especially since the incoming leaders from the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives want to spend a whole lot more than that on all sorts of things. Then the argument that, well, there is not going to be a possibility that you could pass something of that size by the House of Representatives. Well, that one went away very quickly. Betsy McCaw, who's been on the program with before, said Nancy Pelosi made an embarrassing mistake when she met with Trump predicting that he would never get enough votes in the House for $5 billion in border funding. She was wrong, Nancy says. On Thursday night, the House approved the $5.7 billion for the border and sent the measure over to the Senate the following day. Of course, as we well know, it stalled because it needs 9 Democratic votes to pass. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is vowing no votes from his party for border funding at all. And if you say, well, why can't they compromise? Have you ever been involved in a compromise or a negotiation, or maybe even you've been at a place like maybe a tag sale or a garage sale? Tag sale is what they call it in Connecticut, a garage sale, what most people call it, or maybe you've been to a foreign country and there's a table of all sorts of things, and you say, I'll pay you $5 for that. And they go, no, it's 10. And okay, I'll pay you 6. Okay, 9. And you go back and forth. But you've probably never seen a situation where you say, I'll pay you 5, and the person says, no, 11. You go, wait a minute, you just said 10. And that's kind of just or you can do it the other way around, where you are selling it for 10 and somebody says, well, I'll give you 5. And you say, well, I'm going to give you to 9. And they say, no, 4. You go, wait a minute, you're going the wrong way. That's exactly what you've had Chuck Schumer do. He had originally offered $1.6 billion. Now he's offering $1.3 billion. He's going the other way. It's kind of hard to compromise when nobody wants to meet you in the middle. And I suspect that if Donald Trump tomorrow were to say, okay, I'll take 1.3, he'd say, no, I want 1.2. It's just gotten out of hand. And for all of us that say, can't we just compromise on this? Frankly, why are the Democrats making such a big deal about this? Because after all, it is a small amount. Give it, walk away, and consider that you were able to talk him down off of 5.7 and give him 4.6, and he takes it and you say, okay, we were able to negotiate that and we're done with this. But nope. There is a digging in of the heels that I don't think we have seen in a long time, which is why I suspect this will be around for a while. But just before we take a break, let me just maybe mention the fact that this GoFundMe campaign has been unbelievably successful. This was put together by an individual who is a tripule amputee. This picture really doesn't show it very well. He's got a cute family, a very pretty wife, and just a wonderful individual that has literally lost 3 of his limbs, and sadly alone has decided to put together this GoFundMe campaign. And now, are you ready for this? He's getting death threats. Because he wants to put together a GoFundMe campaign to build the wall. Now, there's a large difference between $17 million, which has been raised so far, and $5 billion or even $1.3 billion. But his goal is to raise $1 billion. And at the rate this is coming in, this may be the most successful GoFundMe campaign ever. And so when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how people are reacting, frankly, overreacting to him, and then how there's been a contrary attempt to raise money to help illegal aliens, this GoFundMe campaign called Ladders to Get Over Trump's Wall. So those are some issues we'll talk about after the break. But I'd love to hear your comments. Is it worth shutting down the government to build a wall? Are you excited about the possibility that a private citizen says, I'm not even going to wait for these legislators. We'll go fund it ourselves? I'd love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. And as we go to a break, let me just mention that we're coming to year end. And this is where we really need to begin to hear from you. We are privileged right now to have a matching fund of up to $65,000, which means as you give, you can click on this banner that is on our website, pointofview.net. It says, make your move, give boldly. And as you click there, there's an opportunity for you to give. If you give $50, it becomes $100. $100 becomes $200. $500 becomes $1,000. So I hope that even as we go to a break, you would go to our website right now and help us out financially so we can end this year, this very important academic and calendar year, in the black. We'll be right back.
They are sincere, but respectfully, we think they're wrong. As Kerby said in a recent email, there are Christian leaders claiming that we've lost the sexual revolution, and if we don't compromise, if we don't give up a bit more, we'll lose our religious freedom entirely. Now, you listen to Point of View, you know the truth. We do face battles, but we firmly believe now is not the time to wave a white flag. Followers of the sovereign king never give up or compromise truth. We urge you to stand boldly with us for our freedoms. Some of your fellow listeners have stepped up and are encouraging you to give by matching your gift up to $65,000. In other words, when you donate to this mission, they will double the impact of your gift. Every $20 becomes $40, $50 becomes $100, $1,000 multiplies to $2,000. Invest online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Let's send 2018 out with a powerful statement. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
In the midst of a government shutdown, I'd love to get your ideas, and already some really good ones are coming through. I wasn't even thinking about what we should do during the shutdown, but on our Facebook page, you can again watch Point of View on Facebook. John says, when the government shuts down, Congress should have their wages docked for every day there is no budget with no retroactive benefit. They just lose their pay for those days and then start with their staff having wages stopped. Let's see how long it takes to get that fixed. That was a good idea. And I've got another one here from Bob in Louisiana. So, Bob, I think you've got a suggestion. I think we should have some of you guys working for the federal government. Bob, what's your suggestion for us today?
My suggestion is take all of the employees that have been furloughed and called down non-essential personnel and label the Senate and the representatives as non-essential personnel, take their checks away, and put the people in there who's on furlough to actually do the job. Because it seems to me they're the only ones that actually do their job when they're hired to do what they're hired to do.
I know. I think both of you, whether it's John or you in case Bob, you both are saying, what is going on here? Of course, there have been some that have suggested, even some that are fairly liberal have suggested that maybe we should not allow members of Congress to get their pay if they can't balance the budget. Of course, we wouldn't be paying them at all because we haven't balanced the budget in years and years and years. So you're, again, giving us another hypothetical. It won't happen, but it just, again, illustrates the fact that the non-essentials are not just the people that have worked in the bureaucracy. The non-essentials oftentimes tend to be some of the people that actually are supposed to be our elected representatives. So I appreciate your phone call today.
Yes, sir. Bye-bye.
If you'd like to join us, that opens up a line, 1-800-351-1212. Before I take another call, if you'd like to join us, that number's 1-800-351-1212. Have some other comments that have been posted, but let me talk for a second at least about this GoFundMe campaign. I'd love to know your thoughts about this because I really was sort of caught off guard. A couple of weeks ago, some of you said, well, can't we put together a GoFundMe project? And I said, well, maybe. I don't know what the constitutionality would be. And so then out of the blue, we have an individual, Brian Colfage, who is a triple amputee, military veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, as you might imagine, started this GoFundMe campaign on December 16th. And it's called We the People Will Fund the Wall. And it's a goal to convince the federal government to allocate $1 billion to secure the border. We, as of Monday afternoon, it was like 16.5 million. Now it's up to 17 million and climbing. Matter of fact, it's probably been increasing just even in the hour before we broadcast here. But in his goal, he said, as a veteran who has given so much, 3 limbs, I feel deeply invested to this nation to ensure future government have everything we have today. Too many people and too many Americans have been murdered by illegal aliens, and too many illegals are taking advantage of the United States taxpayers with no means of ever contributing to our society. He goes on to say, look, I have grandparents who immigrated to America legally, but they did it the correct way, and it's time to uphold our laws and get this wall built. It's up to Americans to help out and pitch in to get this project rolling. And so, again, this has been something that has been very successful. And as you might notice, some of the late-night talk show hosts have had some fun. Jimmy Kimmel, maybe you've seen where he said this GoFundMe campaign is being funded by very dopey people, which I thought was one of the nicer things he said. Again, Jimmy Kimmel's, it's free country. He can say fun things about people. He can make fun of people, whatever. When he says that they're taking the money out of their various drug allocations and everything, I thought that was a bit much. But nevertheless, as I pointed out just a minute ago, this poor guy who is served his nation, obviously with distinction, had the idea of putting together a GoFundMe campaign, has had, various kinds of threats against his family. Again, if you haven't seen his family, just a very cute family indeed. They don't need that kind of stuff to actually do what they can to see if they could bring about some kind of remarkable change here. And it's nothing else. This was an attempt to just try to address an issue that isn't just his issue. Betsy McCoy, who has been on the program with us, said most voters name illegal immigration as the most urgent problem for Congress to fix than any other issue, according to the latest Rasmussen National Survey. A staggering 21% of those polled also say they would contribute their own money to build a wall if Congress refuses. And so she says, no wonder the campaign is raised. In that case, it was $16 million. Now it's already $17 million. The third largest haul on the website's history. By the way, it will break records. There is no doubt in my mind that it will. And so how have been people responding to that? Well, okay, for our listeners up there in Connecticut, your Senator Chris Murphy criticized Donald Trump and the Republicans in the House for wanting a wall with Mexico, but not Canada, because after all, Canada is a country filled mostly with white people. Oh, boy. Got to bring race into it every time, don't we? Of course, Betsy McCall points out, he failed to mention that 500,000 illegals were apprehended sneaking across the southern border in 2018, compared with 324 people crossing illegally from Canada, at least according to the Department of Homeland Security. So that's kind of where it is. Senator Marco Rubio, let's give him credit at least, pointed out that insisting on no border wall is like demanding no TSA agents at the airports. Ridiculous. But some of our liberal friends wanted to get into the act on this as well. And that is, interestingly enough, this left-wing activist and transgender military veteran Charlotte Clymer started a GoFundMe campaign a few days later. It's called Ladders to Get Over Trump's Wall. And this is to raise money for illegal aliens trying to seek asylum in the United States. And so that's kind of her plan to raise that. So far, they've raised about $140,000, which is a little bit less than the $17 million so far raised. And one of the other individuals says, again, on our website here, I don't understand people complain that the government's spending money to do this, then will also complain when someone privately comes along and says he'll do it by himself by raising the money without the use of government. And by doing this allows those who are in favor of it to give. And if you're not in favor, don't give. So appreciate that comment. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If nothing else, I think Brian Kolfage deserves the point of view attaboy of the day, in which, as a triple amputee, instead of sitting home and saying, isn't it sad that we can't raise money for the wall? Isn't it sad that I can't get my elected representatives to get together and fund the wall? Says, I know. I will actually create a GoFundMe campaign called We the People Will Fund the Wall. And so far, it's been very successful, $17 million. And again, Charlotte Clymer is welcome to actually have a GoFundMe campaign as well called Ladders to Get Over Trump's Wall, and raise money to help all those individuals that are coming here illegally with any kind of legal help or seeking asylum or those kinds of things. So we come back from the break. I want to talk a little bit more about this just before we get into some other issues. But again, these are some topics that are certainly front and center. And one of the other pieces, which I will probably spend some time posting tomorrow, is this growing list of all the things that the Democrats who are coming into power in the House of Representatives want to fund come January. The particular one I have in front of me here is the Green New Deal, which is an attempt to take the ideas of the New Deal in the 1930s, and even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez even making some comparisons to the Great Society programs of the 1960s. And the Green New Deal would actually create a committee to draft legislation to fight global warming, to turn the U.S. economy into something that would be what would be called a Green New Deal. The estimates are that, again, to have a 100% renewable electric grid could cost as much as $5.2 trillion. Now, that's with a T. We were talking about $5.7 billion. This is 1,000 times more, $5.2 trillion over 2 decades. And, of course, they also want to have, as we well know, Medicaid for all. That one, Medicare for all, I should say, is a plan that at least one center assumed would cost $32 trillion over 10 years. So the next time you hear one of the leaders in the Democratic Party, who will be in positions of leadership in the House of Representatives, complain about $5.7 billion, every project that they are talking about is in the trillions of dollars. And again, for those of you that failed math, trillions are 1,000 times more than billions, okay? So we are talking about spending money we have never even allocated for any of these projects. Where that's going to come from will be a very good question. But I want to get some of your comments. Some of you have some comments about the GoFundMe campaign. So let's take those calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk about millennials and some of the other issues on the news right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Since 2012, First Liberty Institute has been investigating the rise in the number and severity of domestic attacks on religion. Each year, that investigation is compiled into our annual survey. We started that survey because wherever we went, people would tell us that they didn't think there was a genuine threat to religious liberty in our country. We call it Undeniable, the Survey of Religious Hostility to Religion in America. In the past year, the total number of documented attacks on religious liberty has increased by over 15%. Over the past 5 years, we have seen an alarming 133% increase. Of the 1,400 cases documented in Undeniable, you will see a myriad of faiths represented: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh, among others. Religious hostility in America does not seem to discriminate. But there is hope. First Liberty is battling for religious freedom in court, but you can join that fight by simply educating yourself and others about the rights we each have and how we can preserve them. If you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to go to firstliberty.org today and download your copy of the 2017 edition of Undeniable, or order a free copy for your friend. Despite the mounting hostility, First Liberty is prepared to stand against these relentless attacks for as long as it takes. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the other comments on our Facebook page, thanks for the heads up on the GoFundMe campaign. Had not heard about it yet. I love the idea of people funding the wall, and love Point of View radio talk show. Thank you. I know some people are suggesting boycotting Jimmy Kimmel. I don't watch him, and of course, I don't think that's the best way to go. He's welcome to say whatever he wants to say, and we're welcome to say whatever we want to say as well. But some have said, if we're going to have a GoFundMe campaign, how about a GoFundMe page contributing to paying off the national debt? And that actually exists. I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but it is quite possible on the IRS form to pay more than your taxes and to designate that to pay off the national debt if you'd like to do so. Now, there was an individual a while back that suggested that if each person in America just paid $1 more and designated that to paying off the national debt, still going to take a long time, but nevertheless, at least it's a movement in the right direction. So the bottom line is there are some ways in which structurally it's possible to pay off the national debt. And I think there's another one I would highly recommend that the Democratic leadership in the House should consider. I know they'll reject it, but I'm going to put it forward anyway. And that is, given the fact that the tax cuts have actually increased tax revenue. I know this always sounds counterintuitive. You lower the tax rate and you increase the tax revenue, but that's exactly what has happened. Now, that is something we've talked about on this program many times before, but in the month of October, which is the first month of the fiscal year for the federal government goes from October 1st to September 30th. So we already had record number of revenue from October. My suggestion would be let's just enact into law anytime revenue exceeds our expectation, all of that additional revenue goes to pay off the national debt. I know Donald Trump is in favor of that because he's talked about that before. I know Stephen Moore is in favor of it because he's talked about it on this program with us before. I doubt that they will do that, but and we haven't received the numbers for November, but I will predict that November will be higher than last November. And because we have had this explosion in the economy right now, let's take the money that we did not expect to bring in and allocate it towards the national debt. Now, that would be helpful, but oftentimes what they have to do is just allocate it to the federal deficit during that particular year. But it's the same kind of principle you and I use in our finances. If all of a sudden you get some unexpected income, sometimes what do we do with it? We pay off our credit card debt. And the federal government has a credit card debt that is worse than any credit card debt that probably any of you in the listening audience has. And if we're ever going to get to a point where we're not saddling our own children and grandchildren with this enormous debt, we do need to address that. And about the only time we hear anybody talk about the national debt is when the other party is in office, and then all of a sudden a party that never seemed to be concerned about the national debt begins to complain about it. But nevertheless, let's get some more phone calls here. If you'd like to join our conversation in Missouri, KNEO. Katie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I was just telling the young man, my husband and I, the man said that if everyone that had voted for him would put in $80 each to get the whole thing funded. So I just hope that the money is going to be able to go for where it's supposed to go. I guess there's a glitch in this that you can't do it the way it is. So
yeah, and that was one of the things that I would like to survey pretty quickly. Because Brian Kolfage said he had been working with lawyers to try to make sure that that money would go to that intended source. And again, I think even if they were to establish that, you know what will happen. There will be some that are maybe immigrant activists that will go judge shopping and find some judge that will declare that unconstitutional, and so it may get tied up for a while. But I think this is one of those situations where you'd have to say, okay, are there any places where you could use private funds for a private fence? Because there is a sense in which if you're on your own land, you can build them. And there's a couple places where they are building the fence not really in government land, but personal land. So somebody else could still put up a fence that would be helpful in terms of protecting the border. So there might be a way to get around that, but we'll just have to see, and we'll keep monitoring it. But every day I turn around, at last time I checked, it's 17 million. I need to check at the next break. It's probably up even further. It has been one of the all-time success stories of the GoFundMe campaign. So thank you for calling. Let's, if we can, before we take a break, take another phone call. Lisa in Arizona, what's your point of view?
Well, I think we need to have a conversation about the LGBT and the religious right and how they both represent conversion therapy and have both created a suicide problem. And, with the LGBT side, we'll take everybody the religious right rejects. Where does freedom and individual rights step into this conversation where somebody like me can say, guess what, guys? I'm not on your religious rights side, and I'm not on your LGBT side, and I have a strong belief in God, too. And where's my religious freedom? And I hear, the religious rights say, well, we don't want to serve you in business. We don't want to give you shelter. We don't want you to get public assistance. Which is basically saying, hey, go out in the desert, dry up, and blow away.
First of all, I would disagree with just about everything you just said. I mean, I really would. I mean, let's face it. We have a Jack Phillips who says, I feel a little uncomfortable making a cake, but I have not heard anybody, and, I get a chance to know most of these religious right leaders over the years. I've not heard anybody say that you shouldn't have equal rights, you shouldn't have rights to benefits, and all sorts of things. So I just frankly disagree with what you just said.
We don't want to recognize your relationships. We don't want to recognize anything that's better for society. And look, we have a big HIV problem. If you're saying you don't want to recognize, committed and monogamous relationships, and you're living in this world where you're saying, well, we'll only recognize you if you're celibate or pretend to be like us, it's a problem, and it's not even scripturally accurate.
I would disagree with that.
What religious conservative church has a place in their church for eunuchs? Where is the place? I don't see a place in there for eunuchs. The Bible says there are eunuchs. There are people born eunuchs. There are people made eunuchs by man, and there are people who choose to be eunuchs. And it says, with those accept it who can accept it, and those who can't, well, guess what? If you're claiming to be religious and you can't accept that, to me, you're a Pharisee.
Well, again, I wasn't expecting that one as we talk about GoFundMe, but nevertheless, give you a chance to express your opinion. First of all, I would just say real quickly that this argument that we won't allow you to have benefits, first of all, what kind of power do you think the religious right has, given the fact that it's still pretty much a minority position and one that's getting persecuted more and more every single day? But again, can we have a situation where we have what I've always called kind of a live and let live philosophy? You know what? I find most of the religious people that I'm around really do have kind of a live and let live kind of philosophy. They simply said, look, I don't agree with your lifestyle, but, go do what you want to do. And I will certainly express my moral concerns about that, but I'm not going to deny you equal access to the laws. That's not something that's fair or right or certainly even biblical. And then this comment about eunuchs, well, we can have that conversation another day because it gets into some details about sexuality that I wasn't necessarily going to talk about right now. But nevertheless, we need to take a break. And when we come back, I do want to, since it's Wednesday, spend just a little bit of time talking about millennials. And one of the articles we posted is entitled, Millennials Are Poorer Than Their Parents. So we'll talk about that. But as we go to a break, this would be a great opportunity for you to visit our website, find some of the articles we're talking about. But most importantly, I hope you'll click on the banner that says, Make Your Move, Give Boldly. We desperately need to hear from you before the end of this year. And we have a matching fund of $65,000. So I hope even during the break, you'll go there, make your gift to Point of View. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back with more right after this.
They are sincere, but respectfully, we think they're wrong. As Kerby said in a recent email, there are Christian leaders claiming that we've lost the sexual revolution, and if we don't compromise, if we don't give up a bit more, we'll lose our religious freedom entirely. Now, you listen to Point of View, you know the truth. We do face battles, but we firmly believe now is not the time to wave a white flag. Followers of the sovereign king never give up or compromise truth. We urge you to stand boldly with us for our freedoms. Some of your fellow listeners have stepped up and are encouraging you to give by matching your gift up to $65,000. In other words, when you donate to this mission, they will double the impact of your gift. Every $20 becomes $40, $50 becomes $100, $1,000 multiplies to $2,000. Invest online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Let's send 2018 out with a powerful statement. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Next hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, and this is an opportunity to hear from you. And then I want to put a few more things on the table, because after all, this is Wednesday. We always like to talk about millennials a little bit. Although I don't have any millennials sitting across from me, I do have an article we'll get to in just a minute. Millennials are much poorer than their parents. Also want to talk about a couple of books that would be very helpful to you in your ministry to millennials, one of which is on our website today. It's my Viewpoints commentary on the Guide to Culture, which is one that has come out before, but I thought I'd focus on it again, written by our good friend John Stonestreet as well as Brett Kunkel, a practical guide to culture helping the next generation navigate today's world. And then I'll also talk about one that we talked about just the other day with Grant Skeldon. If you're not familiar with that, it is a book that we also will be talking about a little bit later called The Passion Generation. So we got a couple of things related to millennials, but we also have some calls left over from last hour. So let's, if we can, go to Ohio, WGGN, and Benjamin. What's your point of view?
I was just going to say, I know that I could, see the GoFundMe for the wall being funded, but I'm 18 and I just started paying taxes, and I kind of hate paying taxes, and I know a lot of my friends hate paying taxes, and I don't know if
kind of eye-opening, isn't it? All of a sudden, when your parents are paying taxes, no big deal. When you start paying taxes, you go, wait a minute, they've taken a lot out of my paycheck. How did that happen?
Yeah. I don't know if it's realistic that national debt GoFundMe would be funded, because I think it's just their job just the government's job to spend wisely, and I don't think that's happening.
And, I'm going to be talking about millennials in just a minute. Of course, you're now almost in the called iGen generation, but whether you're in Generation Y or Generation Z, I mean, we have put on your backs and even the backs of your future children just an enormous amount of debt. And I can remember a time when the national debt, the accumulated national debt from George Washington all the way up to Ronald Reagan wasn't even $1 trillion. And now we're talking about, in round numbers, $21 trillion. So it's just amazing what's happened. Go ahead.
That's pretty much what I had to say. I don't think it's realistic that that GoFundMe for the national debt will be. I mean, do you know how much that has been given to?
Very little.
Yeah, that's what I would expect.
Right. And what I've said before, interestingly enough, is that we should recognize that you already have that opportunity. And I have these so-called, whatever they call themselves, patriotic millionaires that are saying, well, we want to change the tax code so we can pay more. And I always want to just say, you can pay more right now. I mean, if your name is Bloomberg, or you're the head of Microsoft, or you're the head of, your last name is Bezos and you're head of Amazon or whatever, you can pay more right now. I mean, there's nothing keeping you from paying more. They want to change the tax code to make sure everybody pays more. But the reality is you already have a very high percentage of the federal government, which is paid by just a fraction of those individuals. And so we just have to, when we start talking about the national debt, understand the circumstances we have placed ourselves in right now, because the typical revenue into the federal government is usually about $3.2 trillion, but the spending is about $3.6 trillion. So it is pretty obvious that we're already spending more than we take in. And if you want to really understand this, before I take another phone call, talk about this idea that the top 1% of taxpayers pay 38% of the taxes into the federal government, at least for personal taxes. The top 5% pay 58%. The top 10% pay 69%. And so you can really begin to see that very quickly what you're talking about here is if you were to go out to dinner with 100 people and you were to say, with those 100 people, I want the people most able to pay most of it, then you'd have one person paying for 38 people. You'd have an additional 4 more pay for 20 more people, an additional 5 more paying for 11 more people, another 15 more pay for 17 more people, 25 pay for the rest, and the other 50 people would eat for free. That's where we find ourselves right now in terms of trying to take a national situation and put it into a personal one. You have a large percentage of the population that pays nothing in personal income tax. And as I point out, the top 1% pay 38%, more than a third of the taxes. So just a couple of issues to put on the table. And the national debt was accumulated both under Republican presidents and under Democratic presidents, both under Republican Democrats in the House and Republican and Democrats in the House and Senate. Probably a simpler way to say it. Let's go back to the phones, though. Some of you have a few other comments. And Sean in New Hampshire, love to hear your comments.
How you doing today?
I'm good. I'd love to hear what you want to say.
I was telling the screener that I was originally commenting on this border wall thing, and it doesn't matter to me. Honestly, it's really getting old having to hear it. The average people have so much more to worry about in life, and politics and media and Hollywood has taken control of our lives and turned it upside down. You have to be careful what you say these days. You have to be careful what you do. And it's like, I don't believe that that's how God wants us to live. We live in this free society, and it doesn't feel so free anymore. Everywhere you go, there's something political going on. There's political unrest. There's media unrest. You go on. I got off of Facebook a couple of years ago. I just couldn't take it anymore. Everything is people complaining against each other, hating each other. It's just controlled our lives, and there's so much more to life than this guy getting on Twitter. I like what Trump is doing, but get off the Twitter, man, and just do your job. It's be an adult. We're not adults anymore. It seems like we're all junior high students on the playground poking and stabbing at each other and getting into fights and all of this childish behavior. It's just getting so old. And how do you raise a child in this type of atmosphere?
That's a good question. With social media, like I said, it's first of all the bullying that takes place. Of course, the back and forth, like you say. Most people I meet, Sean, and of course I get to New Hampshire occasionally, and I get to Vermont every single year in New York, so I understand can we just get away from this kind of mindset? And I certainly agree with you, and that's, I think, one of the downsides of the internet, that before you had people that had nasty comments, but they basically kept it to themselves, or they said them, but they only could say it in a limited way at the bar or at the restaurant or something like that. You didn't have people like Jimmy Kimmel making fun of an individual that put together a GoFundMe campaign, because Johnny Carson would never have done anything like that. And, of course, that's the environment we find ourselves in right now, and it is a terrible environment, I would agree, in which to raise your children. Got some more comments, but then I do want to come back to Sean's comment about the millennial generation, some of the things that they're dealing with. We always do a millennial roundtable, so we'll try to convene that as best we can without any millennials sitting across from me. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we need to help the next generation learn to navigate the culture. And that is why I'm so excited that John Stonestreet and Brent Kunkel have written the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. The rowboat on the cover reminds us that this emerging generation will have to navigate through choppy waters. John was on my radio program recently to talk about the book and share his experiences from Summit Ministries and the Chuck Colson Center. Both of the authors have ministered to thousands of students and their parents. They're facing a range of challenges, from digital media to pornography to drugs to transgender issues. They not only focus on the hot-button issues we hear about and read about every day, they focus on the undercurrents in the culture we often miss. Those would be consumerism, materialism, addiction, the sexual revolution, racial tension, extended adolescence, and the key principles of wisdom and virtue. On our radio program, we also talked about the challenges the millennial generation face, especially in an age with greater hostility towards Christianity. They also must do so in a digital world that moves much faster than in previous generations. This book will equip them and their parents to address many of the cultural issues other generations never had to consider. Another helpful aspect of the book is the attempt to answer or refute many of the cultural lies in our society. Technology helps spread these lies quickly. Christians will need biblical discernment to deal with so many lies that are assaulting biblical truth. They say that young people can either celebrate, create, confront, co-opt, or correct cultural trends and habits. Obviously, we must stand for biblical truth and correct cultural trends, but we also must do it with love and compassion. This book provides a model for all of us to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about the GoFundMe campaign. We've talked about building the wall. We've talked about the government shutdown. By the way, if you just joined us in the first hour, I did talk about the 9 myths about the federal shutdown. And if you find yourself in a conversation with people saying, I can't believe we're shutting down the whole government. I can't believe we're closing down all the monuments. Well, first of all, we're not. I can't believe we're doing this and public safety is going to be impacted. No, it's not. And all the other kinds of issues that I thought would be interesting for you, because I suspect we're going to be hearing about the shutdown for quite a while. And because of that, there's all sorts of myths and misunderstanding. And so that's why we posted this particular article from our good friends at Newsmax. Let's go back to the phones, though. In Georgia, WGPH, Derek, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, how are you?
Good. What would you like to share with our audience?
Well, I heard you mention the concept of a GoFundMe for the national debt. I love the idea of the GoFundMe for the border wall. That's fantastic. But the national debt might not be such a good idea. I've been in finance for some years now, and I know government finance and personal finance are two different worlds. But one trend I see is when somebody gets something paid off, they tend to see that open window as more area to spend without regard to what they're spending.
Well said, yes. Yeah.
So I think that we should just let the taxes handle that the best we can and encourage better management in the government.
You know, I have a chapter in one of my other books here on debt. I was trying to find it real quickly as you said that, because one of the things that they have found, interestingly enough, is individuals, for example, even if they declare bankruptcy, Then a couple of months later, they start, because of their credit card debt, they just start spending again because it's the spending habit. And of course, that is exactly the problem
Absolutely.
that we have right now. When we, as we talked about in October, had record revenues coming in October. It showed, if nothing else, that we don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem because as soon as that money came in, I've got this list here of all the things our friends in the Democratic Party want to actually implement the moment they get into power in the House of Representatives in January. And it's like, really? I mean, why can't we just have a law that says any revenue above your anticipated expectations goes to paying off the national debt? Put the federal government on the same kind of plan that I'm sure you've probably had some of your clients be on to eventually pay off their credit card. And same kind of thing we need to have here. I don't want to make it easier for the federal government to spend more money because even when they have record revenues, they just figure out that just gives them a green light to go spend more money and never pay off the national debt. So I'm completely with you, 100%.
Thank you, Kerby.
Thank you for calling. And let's take another phone call here. We'll go to Arizona, KNLB. Gary, thank you for joining our conversation. What's your point of view?
Oh, I had a kind of a lights went on for me. I heard a gentleman commenting on how we're being torn apart in this country and we're hating each other. But I think it would be such a beautiful thing if we all got together and on this GoFundMe thing and make that $5 billion appear quickly, get that wall funded. I mean, while we're doing that, realizing that we all have come together and done a beautiful thing. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, it's very good. And as I pointed out, for those that say, well, I don't want to fund the wall, we now have a second GoFundMe campaign. So the GoFundMe campaign is We the People Will Fund the Wall. It's up to 17 million. I think it's going to be 18 million here before we finish the show here today at the rate it's going. And then you have the other one, Ladders to Get Over Trump's Wall. That's done by a left-wing activist and transgender military veteran, Charlotte Clymer. And that one's up to, I think, 140,000, I think is where we are, 142,000 so far. So you've got both. So fund the wall and even fund the illegal immigrants that want legal help or want to seek asylum or whatever it might be. So there you go. There is an opportunity for anybody to send money to GoFundMe. I suspect, since we were just talking a minute ago with Derek, some of you that are financial planners know the circumstances we find ourselves in right now. That is, some people spent a little too much on Christmas, and so sending money to a GoFundMe campaign might be a little bit difficult. But a good transition would be how difficult it would be for the millennial generation. My third article, no, I guess it's my fourth article on the website is on millennials, and I thought the rest of this segment we'd at least talk about millennials, even though I don't have any millennials sitting with me today around the round table. And that is what we are seeing, interestingly enough, is that this has not been as positive for the millennial generation as it was for others. This particular article says that 30-year-old millennials' fortune, sex lives, and income are pitiful compared to their fathers and what they enjoyed when they were age of 30. Millennial men pay 2.5 times as much for college, have triple the debt, have half the chance of being married, fewer kids, and are much less likely to own a home, according to some of the data put together by Axios. Just gives you a little bit of an idea of how it has been much more difficult. And here's the actual report, if I can quote from it for just a minute. Men are much more likely to earn less, and they're looking at 30-year-old millennials right now. In 1975, only a quarter of 25 to 34-year-old men made less than $30,000 a year, but that number rose to 41% in 2016. When you look at measure of upward mobility, 92% of 30-year-olds in 1970 earned more than their parents at that age, according to a study that was done back then. And so you have seen that millennial men have not done as well, and there are all sorts of reasons. First of all, the remarkable cost, the ballooning cost of college and then college debt, and the whole median debt factor. There's some great charts that you can see here as well that we've posted. And then the other issues of postponing time of getting married. The median family income, although it's been going up, has not been going up for millennial men because, of course, they don't have families. And so that's part of the issue, but also simply because they have had fewer economic opportunities and they also have a significant amount of debt. That being said, millennial women are individually better off than their mothers, but the women's husbands are the millennial men. So you had a kind of interesting contrast there as well. Now, missing from the data, according to this article, is a mention of the causes, one of which would be the federal government's immigration policy of importing one new worker for every 4 Americans who graduate from school or college each year. Of course, we can also talk about the interest rates, which we'll get to a little bit later if we have some time today, the national debt, which we've just talked about, and a variety of others. So I've posted this article, which I think illustrates what we were pretty much aware of, and that is for the millennial generation, it hasn't been as effective for them. And this, I think, also is going to weigh in on a presidential campaign. Back in the 1990s, for those of us a little bit older around the table than the typical millennial, one of the arguments being used by then candidate Bill Clinton is that this generation may not do as well as the previous generation. The assumption has always been in America that your kids will do better than you and your grandkids will do better than your kids. And that did not seem to take place for a while in the 1990s. Then you had the internet boom, exploded, and everybody did very well. Now you have the same kind of situation in which the millennial generation, that would be Generation Y, and the so-called iGen generation or Generation Z are not doing as well. And as many of them are able to vote, they may indeed vote out Bill Clinton, or they were the ones before, I should say, that voted in a Bill Clinton, but this time may vote out a Donald Trump and vote in whoever that Democratic candidate might be. So it's kind of intriguing to see how sometimes the impact on your finances, the question of debt, especially college debt, and a variety of others might have a very significant impact, even though, interestingly enough, we are living at a time where the economy has done very well, but the Dow has dropped dramatically until today. It dropped significantly. Matter of fact, was the worst Christmas Eve Wall Street ever, as far as I can tell. Then today, the Dow has surged more than 500 points. I haven't checked the latest one, so you've got kind of this roller coaster effect. But again, we'll see how that plays out in the next set of elections and whether that means a particular Democratic candidate will be more successful against, we would assume, Donald Trump would run for re-election. So anyway, just wanted to put some of those on the table for you to consider. And at the same time, let me also have you consider what you might do to help us before year end. We are coming to the end of our year, and this is a time in which we desperately need to hear from you so that we can end our fiscal year and this particular calendar year in the black. So if you can help us out, visit the website, pointofview.net. We have a matching fund on the table. That means your gift of $50 becomes $100, $100 becomes $200. So go to pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
They are sincere, but respectfully, we think they're wrong. As Kerby said in a recent email, there are Christian leaders claiming that we've lost the sexual revolution, and if we don't compromise, if we don't give up a bit more, we'll lose our religious freedom entirely. Now, you listen to Point of View. You know the truth. We do face battles, but we firmly believe now is not the time to wave a white flag. Followers of the sovereign king never give up or compromise truth. We urge you to stand boldly with us for our freedoms. Some of your fellow listeners have stepped up and are encouraging you to give by matching your gift up to $65,000. In other words, when you donate to this mission, they will double the impact of your gift. Every $20 becomes $40, $50 becomes $100, $1,000 multiplies to $2,000. Invest online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Let's send 2018 out with a powerful statement. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Next call wants to talk about, of course, something we just mentioned in passing. Maybe we need to get into it in a little more detail. Of course, remember earlier this month, we had a 7-year-old Guatemalan girl who died in custody of ICE. And then, of course, over the weekend, we have this 8-year-old boy from Guatemala died in custody. And again, this is the second death of an immigrant child in detention. So Brenda in Georgia, I think you wanted to talk about that. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I did, because I haven't heard anyone speak about it. I've heard it reported when the first child did, and then I heard it reported when the second child passed away. But, I'm sure they were sick before that, and my concern is, are they doing an autopsy? Has an autopsy been done? Because this could be a health risk for our nation and our children that are in our schools. If these children get in, and it's just very concerning. It's sad that the children passed away. I'm sure they went through a lot in traveling, but at the same time, I wonder about the health risk to our people.
The one thing I do know about the earlier girl is her body was returned to the family in their remote village. And so I don't think there was an autopsy, but I could be wrong on that, if somebody knows otherwise. In the case of this Guatemalan boy, I mean, they went out of their way, as far as I can tell, they, meaning the medical facilities and all the rest. I mean, he was taken to the hospital. He was given prescriptions for ibuprofen, amoxicillin. He was, there were, you don't know all the circumstances, especially when the report is sometimes written in such a way to make it look bad on ICE or the Trump administration or whatever. And part of my point that I made earlier is that if there was a wall...
I missed that. I've been cleaning my house. I missed...
Yeah, that's
you
okay.
were talking about it.
It's okay. It's hard to... Boy, I'm not sure I listened to 3 hours of me either, so, I understand that goes. So there's not a thing wrong with that. But again, it if you do have a wall, maybe it sends a sign that, you're not going to make it here, and you shouldn't be bringing your children. We can solve some of these problems of immigration and asylum at various border stations. And I don't know. I mean, you can say, did they do all they could to save that child's life? One would hope so. I don't know any more than you know.
I believe they did.
Yeah.
I believe they did. I wonder what happened, what was wrong with the children.
And you're raising a good question, because, as I say on this program more than once, when you used to get off the ship at Ellis Island, what's the first thing they did? They would check your health. And obviously, because they were concerned that they might be bringing other diseases from Europe to this country. Does that mean that everybody that came from Europe had a disease? No. Does it mean that everybody coming from South America has any kind of diseases? No. But I think it illustrates the kind of prudent action that needs to take place. So I think you're raising a good question, but just even raising the question will be labeled as xenophobic and racist and everything, which I don't agree with, but I just know it's kind of like the conversation we had with Sean a little bit earlier. Everybody's attacking everybody for almost anything they said. So I appreciate you bringing that up. If we find out more, we'll talk about it here on Point of View. I think we have a few more calls, so let's take those. Nick in Illinois, WPEO. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes. In the early 80s, Volcker and his high interest policies really wiped out probably 30-40% of the farmers, the small farmers.
Yes.
And Reagan was also fighting with Russia. He embargoed the grain. And so there's two similarities, high interest rates and discord amongst nations that exports that wiped out the farm economy. And, the farmers have every right to be distressed, because if the Fed keeps raising interest rates, they'll kill off the economy.
Well, let me get into that, because you've raised very good questions. That's something I talked about in my local hour before, but let's get into it. And that is, first of all, if you're not familiar, the Federal Reserve Chairman, his name is Jerome Powell. And what has happened is that ever since there was the announcement by him some time ago that they weren't going to raise interest rates, they have. And these interest rates continue to go up. And I think that is one of the major reasons why we are dealing with a stock market that is really on a roller coaster right now. Now, mostly it's been down, but again, I want to acknowledge that the Dow surged today. But let me quote from the first article we've posted on our website, because Nick is right on target there. The Dow Jones Industrial Average suffered its worst day on Christmas Eve trading ever, falling more than 640 points. It looks like it's made up some of that today in that rebound. Analysts blame Secretary of Treasury Stephen Mnuchin for announcing Sunday on Twitter that he convened individual calls with CEOs of the nation's 6 largest banks that determined that they have ample liquidity available for lending to consumer, business markets, and all other market operations. That was, of course, implying that there was a reason to worry about that. But here is kind of the circumstances that we find ourselves in right now. While almost all of the data, aside from the stock markets, still point to a robust economy, and again, I'm quoting from this article, the rising interest rates have evidently weighed heavily on companies that took out large amounts of debt during the quantitative easing that took place, of course, during the so-called Great Recession of 2007 to 2008, 2009. But look at the market indicators. We have the strongest job market in decades. We have rising wages. The median family income, when even adjusted for inflation, is better than it's ever been in the history of this country. We have unemployment at record lows for African American, Hispanic American, women, a number of others. Economic growth above 3%, something never achieved during the previous administration. And yet we see that Wall Street worried about liquidity and all the rest. And part of that has to do with what Nick's pointing out, and that is this decision by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, again, Jerome Powell. And part of that comes from a phrase that was developed years ago by a former Fed chairman, William Martin, who said Fed's job is to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. In other words, the economy is so hot and it's doing so well that now people on the Federal Reserve are convinced that it's going to overheat and eventually crash, which leads me to my second article, which I've posted for you to read if you would like to do so. And this one is by Stephen Moore. He calls it Fire the Fed, I should say, in which he was basically saying that, every time you start raising interest rates, it has all sorts of impact. And if you go to about the bottom of the page here, he says, since its peak on October 3rd, which not coincidentally was right after Powell gave a speech suggesting the Fed might be through tightening money, the Dow has fallen at that time by more than 3,500 points. And then goes on to talk about the fact that if indeed they are doing this because they're trying to prohibit and prevent inflation, I love what Stephen Moore says, who's been in the program with us a number of times. Can someone at the Fed please explain how falling commodity prices indicate inflation? Inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. So why is this happening? Why do we see the stock market dropping? Well, one argument, obviously, is increasing the interest rate slows the economy. The first article I posted also raises something that a number of people have been talking about on various blogs, Twitter posts, even Facebook. And I'll just read the quote. Joel Pollack says, some Trump supporters could be forgiven for suspecting a political motive, especially since some noted Trump haters celebrated the market slide in the hope that it will shake Republican support for Trump. In other words, is it possible that indeed that is the case? The drop in confidence also coincided with Democrats winning the House in November, promising tax hikes and more regulations. And if you haven't seen this graph on Facebook, just look for it because it's everywhere right now, in which it shows, if you're looking online here, you see sort of this graph that shows the stocks and the economic growth going like this under the Obama administration, then going up dramatically under the Trump administration, and then dropping, and then the little arrow showing that that drop began the very day that Democrats won enough seats to control the House of Representatives. I don't think any one of those explanations is the complete explanation, but raising the interest rates, some fears about the future of what a Democrat-controlled House looks like, and maybe even some in the swamp that would love to see Donald Trump lose re-election, may be all at least part of the explanations for what we find ourselves in. But as Nick has pointed out only so well, this is going to affect a lot of people. It's going to affect farmers. It's going to affect, houses. I was getting my hair cut today, and the barber was telling me about somebody been in the chair before me, and he was going to buy this house in an area near us and decided to wait a year. And it went from having to pay 3% on his mortgage to now 7% on his mortgage, and he had to rethink whether he wanted to purchase that house. It has implications. We'll talk more about some unintended implications right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Since 2012, First Liberty Institute has been investigating the rise in the number and severity of domestic attacks on religion. Each year, that investigation is compiled into our annual survey. We started that survey because wherever we went, people would tell us that they didn't think there was a genuine threat to religious liberty in our country. We call it Undeniable, the Survey of Religious Hostility to Religion in America. In the past year, the total number of documented attacks on religious liberty has increased by over 15%. Over the past 5 years, we have seen an alarming 133% increase. Of the 1,400 cases documented in Undeniable, you will see a myriad of faiths represented: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh, among others. Religious hostility in America does not seem to discriminate. But there is hope. First Liberty is battling for religious freedom in court, but you can join that fight by simply educating yourself and others about the rights we each have and how we can preserve them. If you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to go to firstliberty.org today and download your copy of the 2017 edition of Undeniable, or order a free copy for your friend. Despite the mounting hostility, First Liberty is prepared to stand against these relentless attacks for as long as it takes. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have quite a number of guests, both in studio and by phone. In studio with me will be Candy Noble, who's newly elected as state representative in the 89th District. Jerry Newcomb will be with us by phone. We'll be talking about some of his commentaries. Many of them are very relevant in light of what is taking place right now. Kimberly Fletcher will be with us, Moms for America. So lots to cover tomorrow. And in between, we'll get into a couple more issues. And just before we go too much further, I was talking about unintended consequences. We certainly see some of this right now in terms of the politics. But I thought I would apply the idea of unintended consequences to Starbucks. If you've not seen this, this is beginning to be a problem. Now, you probably go to a Starbucks in a suburban area, so you haven't experienced this. But Michael Reagan was writing about this, and also New York Post columnist Steve Cuozzo. And it's kind of interesting because there was an announcement, you might remember, that Starbucks said that anybody had the right to use the bathrooms at Starbucks. And you know why. That's because of what happened in Philadelphia. Okay. Well, Michael Shannon at the time predicted this. I love the quote. Brand commitment will erode quickly as the atmosphere in a Starbucks goes from an upscale coffee bistro to a San Francisco public library. And he was talking about, of course, the CEO, Schultz, himself. The stores will now function as the concession stand in a homeless encampment. Let me just quote from this particular article that was in the New York Post. Steve Cuozzo says 7 months after the Coffee Kingdom declared its toilets open to all, no purchase necessary, visitors who hear nature's call are finding it isn't always easy to lighten their loads. Finding a usable Starbucks toilet in the Big Apple might actually have gotten harder since last spring's announcement, and not just for non-customers. Matter of fact, what they did was the New York Post went and conducted a survey in Manhattan of the Starbucks, and they found that a half a dozen toilets were locked or barricaded simply because they were closed for prolonged cleaning, which an insider said was needed after extreme, I love this phrase, soiling caused by drug-using incontinent vagrants. And one Starbucks employee who decided to remain anonymous, wisely so, letting everybody in has resulted in nobody getting in. And so this is what has happened in some of these Starbucks. And again, I know most of you live in an area where you have a Starbucks that's maybe in a suburban airport area. It's not so bad. But it's gotten out of hand in some of the places because, again, CEO Howard Schultz, I understand why he did this. He said anybody can come in and use the Starbucks restrooms. And, of course, you know, all of us at some time or another have made it into a Starbucks or a McDonald's or something like that. And we didn't buy something, but we needed to use the restroom. And so the sad reality is, though, what's happening is in a decision to really provide for, in this case, the underclass, the people who actually go to Starbucks, pay the freight, and expect to have something nice, have seen in many of these urban Starbucks, the upscale bistro, as they said, has turned into kind of a public library, and that's being charitable. So that's another example, I would say, of unintended consequences. So that's just, again, something to pay attention to. And if you're traveling in a city and you decide to go into a Starbucks restroom, be forewarned, especially in the so-called Big Apple. Just before we're right out of time, let me mention that one of the other articles we've posted here today, and I did spend some time talking about it in the very first hour, is what is happening in Syria. And I wanted to post this article by Andrew McCarthy because the other day when we had Nick Pitts on, we really made the case for why we should keep American troops in Syria. So in order to be fair, I wanted to post this very good article by Andrew McCarthy on why he thinks we should really leave. And the argument he is making is that even though we may have been able to degrade ISIS, the reality is we're talking about a situation in essentially this area of the world in which you're going to have continual battles between Sunni and Shiite Muslims slaughtering each other until some strongman takes over. And he says it's been 17 years since 9/11 and 25 years since radical Islam declared war against the United States by bombing the World Trade Center. That was the case that he actually was involved with. And he says that really, in a sense, what we have is a problem that doesn't easily resolve by what can take place on the ground, because we have Sharia supremacy that really is the dominant view. And so whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's the Islamic Jihad, whether it's Shiite or Sunni, those forces are still there. And he basically makes the argument that if we stayed out of the way, America's enemies would continue killing each other. He says, I'm not indifferent to collateral human suffering, but this is what happens in Sharia supremacist societies. He does acknowledge that one of the more compelling arguments to stay is because of the Kurds. We have certainly benefited by the Kurds not only being able to join with us and fight the jihadists, but by their as well protecting them from what the Turks might want to do. And if you've actually been listening lately to National Public Radio, they have this really great quote from Hatam Hassan, who says that if America leaves, we will curse them as traitors, He says the Kurds helped America destroy ISIS. He goes on to say, I have 7 people from my family who were fighting ISIS who were killed, and they were very young, not even in their 20s. That, to me, is a compelling argument, but it may not be the best argument for us to go. And one of the things that Andrew McCarthy points out is, if indeed we really think we should stay in Syria, let's have an up or down vote in Congress. Because, as he points out, the Constitution is not a suggestion, it is our law. And so the point he's making is that let's, in fact, tell the president, by Congress, that we want troops to remain, and maybe they'll remain. Let's have Congress allocate the funds necessary to keep the troops there and not have it taking place by simply a military action. But he then goes on to make a very clear statement. He says, we know the answer to this. It is President Obama did not seek congressional authorization for combat operations in Syria because Congress would have refused. And Congress does not want any president to ask for authorization because members do not want to be accountable. They want to go on cable TV and whine that whoever is president has been heedless, whether going in or for pulling out. So Andrew McCarthy's final statement is this. There's nothing for America in Syria. We haven't defeated ISIS by taking its territory. It wouldn't matter if we did because Sharia supremacist culture guarantees that a new ISIS will replace the current one. The names change, but the enemy remains the same. And if you want to fight the enemy in an elective war, the Constitution demands that the people give their consent through their representatives in Congress. So I want you to hear both the point and counterpoint. There are very good arguments for staying, and that is not to cut and run and to support the Kurds. There are very good arguments for leaving, and that is we're never going to change that culture unless we change the culture itself. And that's not going to be changed in war. That's going to change perhaps with evangelism and the gospel and a variety of other things that might ultimately change that world for the better. That's all we have for today. But just before I wind down the program today, I want you to realize that this time next week, it is 2019, which means we just really have a few days left for you to support this ministry. And I really want you to give your most generous gift to us because we certainly need your financial help. We have a matching fund of $65,000, which means your gift of $100 becomes $200. $300 becomes $600. So anything you can do to help us out would be greatly appreciated. Tomorrow, as I said, we're going to be talking about a number of issues in the news. And, of course, we always welcome your phone calls. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
They are sincere, but respectfully, we think they're wrong. As Kerby said in a recent email, there are Christian leaders claiming that we've lost the sexual revolution, and if we don't compromise, if we don't give up a bit more, we'll lose our religious freedom entirely. Now, you listen to Point of View, you know the truth. We do face battles, but we firmly believe now is not the time to wave a white flag. Followers of the sovereign king never give up or compromise truth. We urge you to stand boldly with us for our freedoms. Some of your fellow listeners have stepped up and are encouraging you to give by matching your gift up to $65,000. In other words, when you donate to this mission, they will double the impact of your gift. Every $20 becomes $40, $50 becomes $100, $1,000 multiplies to $2,000. Invest online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Let's send 2018 out with a powerful statement. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.